Welcome to the Unhurried Living podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 249 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Now, there is a lot being said these days about toxic versions of masculinity. What I've sometimes wondered is whether or not some of this is about men growing older without growing in grace and wisdom. It's why I'm grateful to be talking with Chris Bruno about his book, Sage, A Man's Guide into His Second Passage. And for the women in our listening community, I believe you'll gain wisdom for your own journey as well as for the men in your life. Chris Bruno is the co-founder and CEO of Restoration Project and founder and CEO of Restory Counseling, devoting his life to helping people come alive. In addition to Sage, he is the author of Manmaker Project, A Father's Guide to Initiating His Son to Manhood, and Brotherhood Primer, A Journey into Genuine Masculine Friendships. Chris is a licensed professional counselor with decades of experience helping men recover their hearts. Married for 27 years to his wife, Beth, they have 3 mostly adult children and enjoy adventures in the Colorado mountains or overseas whenever possible. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, would you please follow, rate, and review? And be sure to share this podcast with your friends. And so now, let's dive into my conversation with Chris Bruno. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Chris Bruno, author of the book Sage, A Man's Guide into His Second Passage. Chris, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Well, I've been looking forward to it very much. And I love to start a conversation about a book by asking the author, you, if you could share a little bit of the story of how this book came to be.
Absolutely. Honestly, it started when I was about 16 years old. So this book is about the second passage, the second part of a man's life, but it really started way back when I was an adolescent. I was an exchange student overseas, and I had taken with me some English books. So there were only 3 books that I had, and they were the only English that I had. I was in Germany and everything was in German. I needed an escape just in my mother tongue. And so I went and read these fiction books. And Alan, in those books, I discovered some characters that just spoke to a deep part of my life and my soul. These characters were, it's like Arthurian legend, King Arthur and all that. It wasn't King Arthur himself, it was those around him. And I found within them a caricature of the kind of man that I wanted to be. I didn't have a very good role models of the kind of man that I, was looking at physically close to me or in my family or anything like that. So I was looking like, where's the model for this? So as a 16-year-old, I found them in these fiction books. And I was like, hey, these guys are the kind of man, as I journey through my life, where I would like to end up. And the reality is that they were older men. They were sages. They were these older guys that I just knew I wanted to become. So it started there. 16, I'm a lot older than 16 now. So I've kind of ended up into the season of my own life where now that is actually a possibility for me to become that kind of a man. And so in the last few years, about last decade or so, as I've shifted into that second season of my life, I really kind of sat down with my own self, my story, my past, my future, and began to wonder, Lord God, what do you have for me in this place as I finally kind of come into my own season here? So that's really where it began.
I love that. I enjoyed reading your book very much. And it made me think, of course, none of us are going to argue with the idea that we're in a culture that's really obsessed with youth Everyone's trying to stay as young as possible, as long as possible. And in some ways, your book's inviting us to a very different vision of the trajectory of our lives, the values that we might hold. Can you share a little bit about how your book might be an invitation to us that's a little different than the one the culture is extending?
Oh, absolutely. Well, so in a lot of ways, I just want to say, like you named it, there's an obsession with youthfulness. And I feel like actually, when we begin to step back and look at the trajectory of a life over time, the fullness, I believe, of who God is designing us to be is more in the second half than the first.
Mm.
And we've lost a vision of actually what does it mean to be in our second half of life, that second season, where we have experience and wisdom and resources and knowledge, where we've gained some relational capital with people. We've gained some, like, what does it actually mean to live in the world? And we can kind of settle into who I am versus who I'm trying to become. The first half is all about trying to become someone. The second half is being the person that you've tried to become. And I feel like we've lost our idea of that with, retirement and relegating, old people off to, if they don't know how to work the technology, they have nothing to offer. And like those kinds of mentalities, I think just we lose so much of the design of God for the second season of our lives because we're so obsessed with the first. So I could say far more about that for sure, but just, I actually believe the pinnacle of a man's life and a woman's life is far more in the second season than it is in the first.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it would help us for you to go ahead and say a little more about this first half, second half dynamic. Again, with our obsession with youth, we're not thinking a lot about how a second half of life might look different or how it might be the realization of a first. So can you say something about these two halves and what do they look like? How do they relate?
Absolutely. So in the book, I talk about, several different stages and I focus the book on men. That does not mean that women are excluded from some of these categories, but in my work, my focus in my ministry, it's been on the season of men. There's some similarities and differences. So
sure,
as I talk, I'm going to talk mostly around the man's journey and just because that's more my wheelhouse. But
absolutely,
seasons of a man's life, we have the boyhood season, that adolescent kind of sexual awakening season. Then we kind of head out into what a lot of other authors as well talk about, the warrior season of life, where you're trying to, fight your battles and conquer your hills and establish yourself in the world. My son is currently in that season of his life as he's got his first job and kind of trying to find himself and build a career and all that. There's also what I would then call a wounded season. Now, every warrior who's on the field has some kind of casualties, right? There's some kind of wounding that happens. And so we have to attend to that season of life. Then more the king season, which is where you've okay, I've kind of come out of the wounding back into life and establishing myself and my domain, if you will, the sense of my home, my family, my career, those kinds of things. But I think a lot of us we stop at that point. We stop at a point of recognizing, okay, all the work that I've done in the last 2 decades, 3 decades of building all of those, fighting those battles and kind of conquering the hills and establishing the domain, that's what we assume is the fullness of our lives. And I would say that that's actually all within the first half. All within the first half of our lives. And the second half is where we actually are able to take we might not step off the throne, if you will, as a king, but we might take a little bit more of a breath, a little bit more of a survey of our lives, of who we are, and what is yet to come, and lean into that second passage of life, this second threshold of who can I now be after all of the work that I have done. And I think, in some of that too, we lose parts of ourselves along the journey. We lose parts of ourselves in each one of those stages. And I think the sage, his task is to regather some of those parts that we have lost, tend to the parts that we have not tended to, reintegrate the parts that we have broken off from ourselves, so that we can actually be the fullness of who God made us to be. So that's a little bit of the first and the second half.
No, that's really helpful. It makes me think one of the themes that we often talk about, here with Unhurried Living is the theme of identity. And you talk about that too. It strikes me that maybe in the first half, it feels like identity is this thing I'm chasing. I'm trying to achieve it. I'm trying to prove it. I'm trying to earn it. It seems to me, as I've found myself moving into second half places too, it's that awareness of identity as a gift and a place to rest and a place of confidence from which I live my life and do what I do. Can you maybe talk about some of that?
Absolutely. I love that you just even said the word confidence, because when you begin to break down the word confidence, it means to have, so con means with, and faith means faith. And so confidence actually is having faith with God and who he made you to be, and with yourself and who he made you to be. So I feel like identity is actually having confidence in a greater sense than, and you're right, like identity formation is all in that first half, is usually externally focused. It is, who am I out there in the world, and what kind of echo, feedback, response am I going to get from the world to help me determine who I am? And I think this movement into Sage is, rather than asking externally who I am, it is asking internally who I am, and asking God those same questions, like, who am I and who did you create me to be? And there might be some things that we, the formation, the shaping that has happened over the course of our lives. But really, in the book, I love exploring before you even showed up on the scene, before you even were created, you were a thought in the mind of God. And there was a whole sense of who he designed you to be before you even arrived on the planet. And so that's part of not just who we are in the 30, 40 years of our first half, but who we were in the millennia, eternity past, that we were in the thought and mind of God. So I love coming back to that.
Absolutely. Well, in a couple of chapters in that section where you're talking about the first half, you talk about that tendency toward, projections and personas. I wonder if you can talk some about that facet of our first half.
Oh, absolutely. So when we arrive on the scene, we're in a family and we're trying to figure out, okay, the who am I in the context of all of these relationships? And when we think about this as a therapist and as somebody who does this counseling work, like, I'm thinking often about brain development and identity development of children, and actually the neurobiology of how God wired our brains. So we actually have a sense of our understanding of the world, our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of relationships. All of that comes from that connection, that neurological, psychological connection, attachments that we have in other relationships. So it is some level of feedback that we get, but that's where we begin to project out, like, okay, these internal questions that I have as a boy, I'm going to ask my mother, my father, my sister, my coach, my teachers, what do you think of that? How do I fit here? What does it look like for me to engage in the place that I now find myself? How do I survive the closeness or distance with my mother and father? How do I survive the life that I have been given as a little, boy or girl? So we're asking those questions. Those are the projections, internal questions that we project out onto the world, kind of like a movie projector where you're putting it out onto the movie screen. And you're saying, hey, somebody else answer these questions for me, because I need to know who I am as I find myself in the scene. The personas, if the projections are kind of the masks that I put on other people to help me know who I am, personas are the masks that other people put on me. And the word persona comes from the theater world, where when an actor steps onto the stage, they put on a persona. They put on a character, and that character then acts and engages with the other characters in the story. So a persona is also put onto us by our family. So I'm asking questions of them. They're actually giving me feedback to say, when you are this way, you will receive more attention. or you will not receive attention. When you are this way, when you act this way, behave this way, respond this way, this is goodness for you. This is the best way for you to live. So in my family of origin, there was, I have one older sister, and she is pretty severely mentally and physically handicapped. She has a lot of disabilities. My parents, my mother and father, just really focused on her and her needs. And this was, back in the late 60s, 70s, when institutionalization was kind of the thing that parents would do. Well, they chose not to do that. And I bless them for that. And it came at a cost to me.
Yeah.
Because as the younger sibling, now all of our family was focused, the family kind of ethos was focused on her and her needs, and how she activated my mom and how she activated my dad. And then my job was to help everyone kind of de-escalate from wherever they were, to bring containment and goodness and care for them in the process. So my parents didn't say overtly, here is a persona for you to put on, but I kind of understood from the osmosis of being part of the family, this is when things go better for me. When I de-escalate everyone else, it is better for me too. So that was a persona that I learned, and really, like, it became and has been something that has helped me survive. It's helped me survive that situation as a boy, but then all kinds of other situations. That's just one example. I think we all have many personas. But as we come to, through our lives, how I learned how to survive my family is then how I learned how to survive my job. And then I learned how to survive my wife. And then I learned how to survive my kids. Like, all those projections of personas continue on throughout our lives until they stop working.
Yes.
Until it's no longer the best way of navigating the world. It was when I was a boy. Well, now as a man, it's not. And so therefore, I need to kind of wrestle with those projections and personas and actually attend to the places where they came from. And as a result, stepping across into a second passage. Now, we can get into that in a little bit. But what I would say is that for most of us, men and women both, when we come to the end of our projections, when we come to the end of our personas, that is where we have what is commonly known as a midlife crisis.
Yeah.
Commonly known as, like, I don't know what to do here. The marriage that I had, kind of hooked my identity on is no longer offering me the kind of feedback that I need to have validity anymore. The job I just lost, the child that I had hoped for, all those things they're failing around us. And so we have to come to a place of kind of recognizing, hey, something needs to shift.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And so this first half, second half, you're talking about sort of this transition window or season of midlife. And I think a lot of the caricatures of midlife look like men going backward to some earlier stage of, trying to recapture their youth. Whereas the invitation to midlife, what I hear you saying, is into an even more fruitful season that you perhaps hadn't imagined.
Exactly. And I love that you just said that. A lot of us go back trying to redouble our efforts or try the same thing again. And this is classic midlife crisis stuff, right? This is, hey, if this wife didn't work, and maybe another one will. And maybe, if this career didn't work, maybe another one will. And it's just, we redouble our efforts going back through those, the adolescent sexual awakening stage, the warrior stage, the king stage, just for trying to rebuild it. And the reality is there is something else more beyond it. Rather than going backwards, I think we need to be called forwards.
Absolutely. Well, so one of the things you talk about, and I think it's an important one, many men, I think, envision their second half of life as aiming for retirement, like it's a finish line, and I crossed that, and then who knows what else there is except, I don't know, golf and travel and leisure. But, the invitation to being a sage is a very different vision than the vision of retirement. And now I don't have any responsibility anymore.
Yeah. The vision of a sage is much older than the vision of retirement. The vision of the
Yes.
sage is, as long as humans have been in existence, the vision of retirement is really only in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so I love that you bring that up, because for those that work hard and, save money and establish their retirement accounts and all that kind of stuff, I do want to bless their desire to have a reprieve from the grind, from the work, from the 9 to 5, whatever they have done. So I don't want to say like golf and cruises and whatever else, you finding a second house down in somewhere where it's warm, like whatever it is that you think of as part of retirement goes, those things are in and of themselves not bad. What I want to ask people to consider is, in your disappearance, what is it that you are leaving behind? Because I feel like where we are as a society is that we do not have sages, because retirement has taken them away. And what we actually need is, and a sage is not just someone who is old. Not every old person becomes a sage. Not everyone who has some age is an elder.
Yeah.
So there is something of, like we're talking about, this internal work that a sage needs to do. But the unfortunate reality is that not only do we have the great disappearance of the older generation, where they're off to golf, but then in the wake of that disappearance, we don't have their presence, we don't have their wisdom, we don't have their settledness, we don't have their connectedness, we don't have their experience to guide the younger generations. And so we don't need more advice. We don't need more, information. There's experts about everything everywhere. What we need far more is the presence of sages in our lives, because it is the presence that I think that welcomes us into the presence of God and into ourselves even more. So that is what I hope for sages. So bless your golf game.
Yeah.
And don't leave.
Yeah.
Don't
See, I'm sorry. Yeah. I just think wonderful if retirement has given you a place of freedom. The question could be, how would you like to use that freedom?
Excellent.
How would you like that? What would feel meaningful to you? What would bless those around you? You might find you like that alongside your golf and your travels and your experiences of leisure.
Yes, absolutely. And, the word I like to use of a sage is that the sages are like the pylons of society. That when there are strong and present sages around, even if they are off, playing golf, but they still show up at church on Sunday, or they're part of the family gatherings, those kinds of things. They are the pylons of society, holding us, grounding us, bringing a level of containment to our worlds, both the mental and emotional and spiritual worlds. They bring that stability. And when we don't have that stability around us, that's where we get so, kind of chaotic and crazy and trying to figure things out, because there's not that grounding wisdom to kind of hold us together.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. I'm thinking of, I think Pete Scazzaro shared this on our conversation a little while back. He's the one I've heard him say, when it comes to it, your most productive decade will be your 60s,
yes,
followed by your 70s, followed by your 50s, which is a way of saying the season of being a sage is going to be the most fruitful and most productive. And that's probably not going to happen with a retirement vision of the end of my life.
Yes. Well, and I love how you even said it, that if there is a retirement vision, let it be unto something. Let it be a freedom that you now have from the responsibilities that you had, in order to then offer something different, something new.
Absolutely. Well, you hinted at this a minute ago, but one of the sentences in your book that really stopped me, and it was an ouch. It's old men who do not become elders merely become elderly. I'm going to guess that most of our listeners don't have a vision of, I can't wait to be elderly and all that I sort of imagine that looks like. So it implies that there's a way in which I cooperate with this process into which God's invited me to become a sage. Can you say a little bit about what it looks like to lean into God's invitation, to grow in grace, to grow in wisdom like this?
Absolutely. So it's hard to bring into, I don't want to bring a cookie cutter into what it's going to look like for you versus what it's going to look like for me. But I think instead of actually a specific roadmap, like we would have, a driving map, I prefer something more like a nautical map, which is like in this general direction are some of the ways that I feel like God is inviting us. So
I like that.
So first, I would say that some of it is to do some work around where have you been? What has the story been of your life? And I don't just mean like the itinerary of I grew up here and then I went to college here and then I got married here and we had these kids here. Like that's scaffolding, helpful to the framing of where you have lived. But your story has far more to do with the formation of who you are and the moments of great goodness and great hardship, and how have those shaped and formed yourself and your interpretations of what it means to be you in the world. And by and large, Ellen, the thing that shapes us the most, and this is kind of the unfortunate reality of living in a broken and fallen world, is what shapes us the most are the hard times.
Yeah.
The traumas we've lived, the losses we've had, the griefs that we've had to walk through. Those are the things that shape us really the most, because those are the things that we have to survive. And it's in our survival that we then kind of go back to those projections and personas that we were talking about before. So to do some work of some review of your life, where have you been? Where has it felt like there's been great goodness and great hardship in your life? And then secondly, like what parts of you in those times did you feel like you needed to split off from, walk away from? Exile. I don't like how I was that way, so I will never be that way again. Or I will always be this way. Like, what are the kind of vows that you made in your life to be or not be a certain thing? And then wonder, with kindness, wonder what was happening for you there? What did you need there? If there was the presence of kindness in that moment, what would it have sounded like? What would it have been like for you to have not the need to survive, but to have someone join you in that place? One of the things that stops me every time I talk about this is this hard sentence. No one is coming for you. No one is coming for you. No one else can do this work for you.
Yeah.
No one else can heal those internal parts. Now, yes, there is an invitation of God to be present in then and in your life and touch those places, but no one else. I can't ask a counselor. I can't ask a pastor. I can't ask a coach. I can't ask my wife to do this work for me. I have to do this work for myself. And so it's actually tending to those places inside of our lives and stories that have not actually been tended to so far. And then in the book, I lay out some specific areas that I feel like are important postures really to take as a sage, some characteristics of what a sage looks like. That again, there's probably 1,000 more postures that are possible, but these are the few that I feel like are just generally the ones I see most often. And so there's some leaning into those.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm remembering you listed sort of 6 postures or facets of what it looks like to become a sage, or what it looks like to increasingly be a sage. I remember at least one of them was contentment, which is about as un-American a virtue, and certainly not a very happy first half virtue. Can you say more about that as a developmental sort of thing in our lives?
Yeah. Well, just think about someone who you know, like as a listener, stop right now and just think about someone that you know, where you kind of walk into their presence and there is not this overwhelming energy coming from them to fill the space, to overpower you, to be something big, that there is something just like you just kind of go, oh, yeah, like I can be at rest because I am in the presence of this other person. That person's energy is not to grow the bottom line anymore, or become something big, or have a big name, or worry about their reputation. Their focus, their contentment has taken over to such a degree that there's this settledness to them. Mm-hmm. And you're just welcome into their presence, and you just get to be there, and they're curious about you. They're excited about who you are. They're wondering about what God is doing in your life, like those kinds of things. There is a contentment that has kind of overtaken them. And we see contentment throughout the scriptures. We see contentment in people that have done this kind of work, because there's just whatever I have or whatever I don't have. That's not the issue anymore. It's who I am. It's not about what I have. It's who I am and who I've become. That is the settledness. And I just say that, and even inside my body right now, as I'm talking, like I can feel the settledness come back into a space of like, okay, there is someone who is bigger than me, and that is okay. And that is actually good.
Yeah. Even as I was listening to you unpack that, it seems to me that in my first half, one of the words that would have described a lot of those seasons was restless. I was striving for something. I was shooting for something. I was trying to be something. And I think as I move into my 60s now, I'm finding rested is increasingly a good thing. It's not a settling. It's not a giving up on, making a difference. It's actually something simpler like bearing fruit, which is a lot less strenuous looking anyway.
Yeah. Well, and you just even use the word settling in a way that we typically use the word settling. Like, right. I'm going to settle for something less. Yeah. Okay. Like if a court case gets settled, that means that there's been some kind of mutual agreement to not what your ideal is, but to something less. I want to say the settledness is actually something far more of this, just the goodness, experiencing the goodness of God. And I think that's actually what you're talking about. But we typically, it's like, I'm not going to settle for that. I'll take this, whatever.
No, absolutely. Well, I wonder if I could ask you, just as we kind of come to the close of our conversation, if you would extend a word of encouragement or invitation to our listeners, kind of in the spirit of this message that you've written about.
Oh, absolutely. So I'll kind of try to hit the low end of the age spectrum and the higher end of the age spectrum.
Thank you.
Okay. So on the higher end of the age spectrum, like if you're listening to this and you're like, go back to that phrase that caught you, Alan, which is, I may not be an elder, but I know that I'm elderly. It's never too late.
Yes.
It is never too late to do some of the work that I think God is inviting you to. And even if you have stepped into retirement and disappeared, there is nothing saying that you can't reappear.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to encourage you who are in that upper level of age range to just say, hey, okay, whoa, hold on a minute. Maybe my time is not yet over. And maybe as Pete was saying, the goodness of what I have to offer the world is yet to come. The best is yet to come rather than what has been. So I want to encourage you that it's never too late. And then for the ones that are younger, maybe, in those 20s and 30s range, gosh, you guys, I was 16 when I began to think about what the sage that I wanted to be. So I would encourage you to be thinking, not short circuit, live into the warrior stage, live into the king stage, live into all of those, but recognize also that this is not the end either.
Mm-hmm.
This is not the fullness. This is the journey. This is part of the journey, but to recognize there's still something more in that. What is this stage for you now? What is this developing inside of you? And it actually becomes easier as you step into this second half of your life. If you've done more attentive work in your life and in your story along the way, yes, it's far easier for you to make that step across that next threshold. It's those of us that have come to that next threshold and they're like, oh crap, I have a lot of work I need to do, right, kind of catch up with myself. But if you're doing the work along the way, I think that whole journey becomes a lot more paved. So I would encourage you in that as well.
I wonder if you would have a word for the ones right in the middle there, that think that maybe I think I might be in that middle space between first and second half. And man, I'm finding that hard.
Yeah. Well, and finding that hard, I just want to say welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome to finding that hard. And I think some of the reason that I wrote this and am doing this is I'm trying to live this myself, right? I'm trying to figure this out myself. And so welcome to that midlife journey of trying to figure some things out. And I hope what I have to offer, and then a lot of the other references that I have in the book, other authors have to offer some goodness here. There's not that many who have some things to say about this season of life, but there are some. And so I would encourage you to listen and engage. And if you are feeling a little bit in the like chaos crisis mode, rather than engage it as a crisis, what if you engaged it as an invitation?
Yes.
An invitation to do the work, an invitation to step back and wonder, an invitation to your word rest. Like, what if you just brought it down a couple notches and go, okay, God, what do you have for me here versus what do you expect me to do? That would be my invitation to those that are right in that middle age range of finding things hard right now.
Oh, that's so good. Well, again, today my guest has been Chris Bruno, and we've been talking about his book, Sage, A Man's Guide into His Second Passage. Chris, it's really been a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, thanks again for having me on the show.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Casey Tigert, David Zahler, and Tyler Staton. I'll also share an episode on the process of working with God. I can't wait to share those episodes with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.